Hey everyone, it's April 8th and welcome to More Layers. I'm Seth Mariano.
And I am Jordan Smith. And for this week's episode, because of the recent Snow White movie that released, we figured it would be a good time to kind of dive a little bit into the whole idea around Disney's live action remakes.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting shift that's been happening lately. I mean, there was a time when I think there was a more positive reception toward the Disney film remakes, like with Flubber in the late 90s, early 2000s for one, but in the past few years with the reimaginings of say Cinderella, Lion King, and The Little Mermaid, there's been a more or less cynical perspective or feeling leading up to their releases anyway.
Yeah, and that's especially the case as more of them get released, because to a lot of people, they start to feel more like a cash grab, or they're just phoning it in because they're like, oh, we're banking on nostalgia, so we don't have to try as hard. But for my notes today, instead of kind of just going down a list, I more so kind of divided things into categories so that the first section I kind of go into the concept of a live action remake, what could make it work, what might not make it work. Then I'll go into some of the controversies or things in remakes that have led to divisiveness. And then at the end, I'll touch a little bit on a couple of them that I actually kind of liked. So, and for the concept in general, on paper, it seems like it could potentially be a good idea. Because, I mean, there's a connection you can form with these cartoon characters, especially with the magic they were able to create when we were kids. And then there's a different type of connection you can make with them with seeing them in a quote unquote realistic setting. Not to mention that Disney does have a point to a degree where banking on nostalgia can work because it brings people back to stories they've loved for years. It can make them feel like a kid again. But as good idea as that may sound, it can also easily backfire, as we've seen. And then, as I mentioned as we kind of started this episode, as more of these come out, they seem more like cash grabs that are banking almost solely on nostalgia. I feel like some people may have caught on to this earlier on than some, but it seemed like they were just remaking a couple. And it's like, okay, that's cool. And then they started making more of them and more of them and more of them, some of them rather quickly. They're like, okay, this doesn't even feel like they're just bringing back a couple every once in a while. It just feels like they're just going down the list. Which ones have we not hit yet? And even Moana, it was only about 6 years old before they announced it was getting a live action remake. And then when it comes to making a live action remake, I feel like it can be extremely tricky, especially when it comes to how much you do or do not change when compared to the original. If you don't change anything or very little, then there's going to be a lot of people who will think, oh, this is just a lazy or shot for shot remake. We already know what's going to happen. So what's the point of seeing it? But at the same time, you don't want to change too much, because if you do, then it becomes very unfamiliar to people. The whole banking on nostalgia thing kind of falls flat. And people would say at that point, why not just make a whole different movie entirely, or at least have it under a whole different name with a slightly different story instead of just attaching it to something we're familiar with. So it is a tough call to make. And you really want to find that balance, which is very difficult to do. If you can find that sweet spot, though, then you might be able to strike gold, or in at least the live action remakes cases, come up with something that people might consider at least half decent. But the bar has already been set pretty low with a lot of these remakes, so it's kind of hard to tell now. So then moving on to why some of these remakes have sparked controversy or divisiveness for one reason or another. The first one that came to my mind was when Emma Watson was cast as Belle for Beauty and the Beast. A lot of people weren't sure if she could sing or not. And then when the movie came out and they could clearly hear some blatant uses of auto-tune, that just further increased their worry or concern about this casting. And then for the iconic dance with her and the Beast, a lot of people had an issue with her dress because it's like this gold, not necessarily shimmering like diamonds type of thing, but it's very elegant, very flowy, and there's just such a beautiful and unique design to it. But then the live action remake, her dress wasn't even like golden-ish, and then it felt very plain. A lot of people were joking like she bought it off at Temu or something like that, which I honestly thought was kind of funny, if not accurate, for all I know. And I was kind of on board with it. But then you get something like The Little Mermaid. A lot of people are already skeptical at this point because this is later on in the timeline of live action remakes. But the biggest thing I saw people getting upset over was the casting of Halle Bailey. And for many people, it's because she didn't look like the animated Ariel, because the animated Ariel was white and she had red hair, whereas this Ariel was black and it was like a darker red brownish. And I'm thinking the whole time, I don't care what she looks like in the end, as long as she kind of can be associated with the original character. But it's like, as long as she can sing and act, I don't care who she, who is she, excuse me, who she is played by.
Yeah, there was a
But
similar controversy that happened with the 2014 remake of Annie, starring Quvenzhané Wallace in the lead role, about her being black because the reasoning I heard was that it's always been a character played by a white actress or been portrayed as a white person,
right.
but uh, but the argument that I've heard is the character is a fairly racially neutral, totally fictional character, so it doesn't really necessarily matter.
It really doesn't. Because again, as long as they can act and sing, who the heck cares? And especially with a mermaid who's a mythical creature. I haven't seen The Little Mermaid or that version of Annie for that matter, so I can't say how well their performances come across or not. Um, but if the biggest thing people get upset about is the way they look, then that is kind of problematic in some ways.
I mean, unless it's like their ethnicity or background or ancestry is like clearly defined, like in the character arc or something, then
Right.
really shouldn't be that big a deal.
Yeah, exactly. Like there might be some lore attached to it that specifically says, hey, this is what this character looks like definitively.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because
unless they give like that specific detail, then then don't complain about it.
yeah, um, this kind of brings me to a side note where I read recently that for Netflix's reimagining, as they said, of Narnia, there was word going around that supposedly Aslan could be played by Meryl Streep, which I'm not sure how I feel about that one. Because, I mean, Aslan has always been depicted as a male lion and has some loose connections to the story of Jesus. So it's like, I'm not entirely sure how they're going to work with that. Granted, in some stories, a male character has been played by a woman, like in a lot of musicals or animated shows. A male can be played by a female for one reason or another, but something about Aslan being played by a woman doesn't sit entirely right with me, but maybe when more information comes out, I'll think differently.
Yeah, I think Meryl Streep is a decent actress generally, but I feel like yeah, I really don't personally like the idea of Aslan being gender swapped because kind of like you said, it's always been kind of like interpreted as a sort of a parallel fictionalization of Jesus more than anything. That's kind of my reasoning. So
And some people may wonder if he actually is or has any connections to Jesus Christ. And I'm thinking the biggest thing that or there's like a small handful of things that really connect Aslan with Jesus or Narnia to the Bible. The biggest thing that most people would recognize is how Aslan is killed and then he comes back to life. But there's more, a little more to it than that, because Aslan, like Jesus in the story, did not do anything wrong, and yet he gave up his life for someone else. And then only after that happened did he come back in full force. And then people have said that the creation of Narnia is like the creation of the world, and the last battle is kind of like the end of the world, kind of like Revelation, something similar to that. But in any case, not to go too far off track, but until I hear or see more, I will admit I'm a little bit skeptical about someone like Meryl Streep playing Aslan. And considering this is technically Disney and it's live action, I feel like it counts. But of course, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, they're far from the only movies in the live action remake lineup that have caused some issues. Lion King from 2019 definitely had some issues right from the get go. One being, it's hard to call it live action for a lot of people because the vast majority of the movie, if not all of it, was CG. So while it definitely looks realistic, for a lot of people, technically speaking, it can't really be considered live action. And then with that sense of realism came a different problem entirely, where a lot of the animals looked so realistic that they weren't really able to emote. Like they couldn't visibly express how they felt. And because of that, a lot of the more serious moments didn't really have a lot of punch behind it. It just looked like they were speaking with a plain face, and you couldn't really take much of it seriously.
yeah, it is kind of tricky. I feel like with if you're dealing with, I guess, Well, this was more of a case than of actual trained animals that was appearing on screen and then voice acting being dubbed in to it. I think back to Homeward Bound: The Incredible Journey, and um, you didn't really like see necessarily moving mouths or facial animation or anything. They just looked, but they looked nonetheless not very expressive. And but I feel like in that case, though, the voice acting kind of distracted enough from that that it didn't really ruin anything.
Yeah, I can definitely get behind that. Like some of the voice acting, I will say, was at least decent in the Lion King live action remake. I know a lot of people were really excited to hear James Earl Jones again, and he was still good because, I mean, hey, it's James Earl Jones, but you could definitely tell that he'd gotten older. And that's nothing against him. It's just like as you get older, it can be hard to do the things you used to. So while he definitely got Mufasa across for the most part, there were definitely times where it didn't hit as hard as his original reading of the line in the animated film. And now thinking about it, not necessarily related to that, but I remember when this movie came out, there were a lot of people who were not happy with how they treated the Be Prepared song. Because for many people, that is one of their favorite Disney villain songs or Disney songs in general. And the fact that it was so short in the live action remake and half of it was spoken, not even sung, definitely upset a few people. And then moving over to the live action adaptation of Aladdin, there weren't too many people that were upset about the movie in general. Uh, I know people were happy with the casting of Aladdin and Jasmine, or at least quite a few people were, from what I understood. What I think a lot of people had issue with was Will Smith's interpretation of the genie. Because when they first showed what he looked like in like the blue version of him, because he also just looks like himself dressed as a genie, that looked fine. But when the blue CG came on, then it didn't sit right with a lot of people. And I can kind of get behind that because then when he takes a more human form, then he somehow just makes it a lot more entertaining for many. But the CG was just so distracting for a lot of people. I was kind of on the fence about it, but going into this movie, I told myself, as long as I go in knowing that no one is going to top Robin Williams, excuse me, Robin Williams' interpretation of the genie, then I think I'd enjoy it okay. And that's pretty much what happened. Knowing that people would not be able to match him, I think personally Will Smith did okay. And then, of course, some of the biggest controversies in Disney live action remake history came with the most recent one, and the one that really sparked our interest in talking about these movies today is Snow White. There were a lot of issues going on even way before the movie came out. Even when all they had was a screenshot or two depicting what many people at least thought were the seven dwarves, people lost their minds. And then you got the CGI dwarves that a lot of people said didn't look really good at all. Some songs were changed, left out, or added in that didn't really work. But I think a lot of the controversy was set around the casting of the two main leads, that being Snow White herself and the Queen. There wasn't, from my personal viewpoint, there wasn't too much controversy around Gal Gadot as the evil queen, especially when compared to Rachel Zegler as Snow White. But there were some people that were definitely having problems with it. But Rachel Zegler was definitely the center of attention most of the time, and not in a good way. Because early on in some interviews, she was kind of bashing on the original version, like the original animated film that really got Disney going in the animated film industry. And she was referring to the prince as a stalker, which a lot of people didn't like. And then one thing that people caught on to that didn't make sense is one thing she was going on about is like, oh, she doesn't need a prince to save her. She doesn't need anybody. She's gonna grow up to be the leader she knows she can be. And after the movie came out, the leadership aspect was kind of there, even though, from what I've heard, because I haven't seen the movie, from what I've heard, a lot of the people that follow her in this film do so because she knows their name and not much else. And then the whole idea of her going, oh, she doesn't need a prince to save her, she kind of does, because from what I've been told, he still kisses her to wake her up, which she had a big issue with, and yet it still happened. And of course, similar with Halle Bailey, race was a center of conversation for this casting, especially because the character's name is Snow White, and in the animated film, she's described as having fair skin that is white as snow. So I will admit, because of that, I was a little iffier on this one, at least at first. But I still tried to keep the mentality, as long as she can sing and act, I think it'll be okay. And I remember seeing her in the remake of West Side Story, and I really enjoyed that. So it's like, okay, I think this could potentially work. Um, and then when the movie comes out, apparently the way they get around the whole Snow White thing is they say she gets this name because she was born in a snowstorm, I guess. It's like, okay, I guess that works. But yeah, there were a bunch of issues leading into this movie. And as the release of the film got closer, there seemed to be more and more coming out. I won't go into one or two other ones that became the center of attention, because those are an entirely different beast, as it were. But as more of these movies come out, and even with this newest one, there always seems to be more controversy. And I think this had some of the most amount of controversy out of any live action remake. And word going around is it got so bad that Disney, who had previously announced doing a live action remake of Tangled, are now putting that on pause, which makes me wonder what sort of things were they going to do with it that they would be this concerned about it.
Yeah, I kind of like to think a lot of it has to do with the cancel culture we're living in now.
Mhm.
Like people and the media will see even the slightest inconsequential little thing or something that's not even intended to be that big a deal, and they will pounce on it so savagely and so judgmentally. It'll honestly like scare the creators or the creative forces into running for the hills.
Well, hopefully, as much as I agree with that, Disney will also take this time to analyze what could work for a live action remake, what may not. And as I mentioned early on in this episode, find that sweet spot where they don't change too much, but just enough that it feels fresh and new. And hopefully keep in mind who they're casting ahead of time so that they avoid some of this issue again. But to give an idea of how negatively this movie was received, there were several videos that came out shortly after the movie was released of people, even Rachel Zegler herself, sitting in a movie theater that otherwise was completely empty. And I think financially speaking, this movie has been considered a flop as it made nowhere near what it needed to be considered a financial success. So I feel like putting live action Tangled on pause could be a smart move right now so they can look back and see in their library what worked, what didn't, take all that into account. And then if they continue to make more, which they definitely are because they have a live action Lilo and Stitch coming, they might still make live action Tangled. There's been word for a long time about a live action Hunchback of Notre Dame. So I think this could be a good breathing moment for them to regroup and hopefully put together something that is a lot more promising.
Yeah, one thing I will say, was thinking about the recent remakes of Cinderella and the more recent Snow White. I feel like a lot of the like modern criticism has been like the gender depiction or the one-dimensional princes, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I feel like while I've never watched either release, at least not yet, but I have heard that one guy I follow on that I have watched frequently on YouTube, describe like the princes, the versions of them in these remakes or reimaginings, a little more fleshed out, and they actually give the princes more screen time with their respective, I guess, female counterparts, and to kind of develop them a little bit more before their more romantic encounters later.
Sure.
So that sounds at least like an improvement.
Yeah. Okay. A step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Then my last category was, were there any live action remakes that I at least liked? Maybe not necessarily loved, but still watched and thought, you know what, I enjoyed that. And out of all the ones I remember watching, there were two. The first being Beauty and the Beast. That could partially because Beauty and the Beast is one of my favorite stories in general, and definitely my favorite Disney movie, probably. Uh, but I felt like for the most part, all things considered, it did well enough. It definitely still had the issues, like I mentioned with the auto tune for Emma Watson. I also wasn't a big fan of LeFou kind of becoming a good guy near the end. I don't know why. I just feel like with the animated LeFou, no matter what Gaston did to him, he just always admired being in his presence. Like something about just being next to him always excited him. And just seeing him suddenly near the end fight with the good guys, it's like that seems kind of odd. But maybe it's just because it's not what I was used to. But I still think Beauty and the Beast was okay. I felt like the casting was pretty decent overall. There were definitely one or two that I feel like could have been chosen differently, but that's beside the point. But Beauty and the Beast was at least okay, at least for me. And the other one was Aladdin. I didn't have too much of an issue with Will Smith as the genie. In fact, I loved when they were just in the desert and he was like, be specific with your words. It's like you could say, make me a prince, and boom, there's a prince right over there. I made you a prince. It's like, you know what? That's actually kind of clever. I like how they did that. Uh, so I thought his interpretation was okay. The casting choice, the one casting choice in this movie that I didn't really like was the casting of Jafar. I honestly want to say that this guy is a good actor. Maybe he's done well in other stuff, but I just could not take him that seriously as Jafar. Because, I mean, he did not look threatening. He definitely did not sound threatening. I feel like the deep, slithery voice is practically a must when casting this character. Like one scene that always pops into my mind when talking about this is when Jafar betrays Aladdin and throws him back into the Cave of Wonders. Like in the original film, when he's dressed up like this creepy old man, he's like, I'm giving you your reward, your eternal reward, in this really deep, creepy tone as he's about to stab him with a blade. And only after Abu bites him does he let go. But then in the live action remake, when the same approach is made, Jafar, in a not threatening tone at all, he's just like, how about my foot? And then he just kind of kicks him. It's like, that doesn't seem threatening at all. I will say there was one line Jafar had. I can't remember exactly what the wording is, but I think it's after he first like meets up with Aladdin, and the line is something like, "Steal an apple, you're a thief. Steal something else, and you're a statesman." Something like that. If I could remember exactly how it went, I'd say it. But from what I remember, it was still kind of clever. But that was a rare example of something done well with him. And then the final battle with him, he doesn't even turn into a giant snake. Instead, Iago becomes just a bigger bird and it ends up being a chase scene, which did not sit that well with me. And it's just like the movie overall, I still enjoyed, but the issues I had with it are very noticeable and can kind of pull me out of the movie for a second before I start to enjoy it again. So, do I think overall, do these live action remakes have a positive future? I don't know. I feel like if they can get their act together, and as I've mentioned already a couple times, find what works, they might be able to start pumping out some good ones. And this just could be a slump that Disney's in because this is not the first time they've done that. Like with the Disney Renaissance, they came out of a slump with those films. And then they went back into a slump for a lot of people when they started doing these direct to VHS, direct to DVD sequels that very few people seem to have watched, let alone liked. And then they bounced back again with movies like Tangled and Frozen. And now they seem to be back in the slump again with these live action remakes. So maybe if they stop making them or they find a good formula, they can get out of this slump and keep going. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah. To prepare for this recording, I did watch or listen to rather, the little talk by Nostalgia Critic that Jordan sent me about the what he considered the one key thing that was missing from these Disney reimaginings, and he talked a lot about like like what what I guess I would call emotional power, and basically he kind of talked about the idea of you know films are kind of meant as a sort of escapism from reality, and we kind of you know so you naturally want a film um, that that in your head is not realistic, but something you can feel in one way or another.
Yeah, that's definitely the central topic. The video was like 30, 40 minutes long, but he
More
definitely
like
was talking
45.
about what?
More like 45.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Basically, it was a longer video, but he went extensively into emotional storytelling and how these live action remakes would take certain key points, aspects, metaphors, or what have you, so literally that the potency behind them was lost. And like Disney is associated often with the word magic, and with the way these live action remakes are being made, it's losing that magic. So it needs to find a way to bring that magic back. Otherwise, it could be financially or otherwise in big trouble.
Yeah, it sounded like a major criticism that he expressed was that these newer remakes maybe try too hard to explain or fill in and blanks regarding backstories and things like that. And I don't know. I feel like there's been a kind of the reverse criticism in popular culture when when people describe in depth the original films. They say like that is so like that would be considered like socially offensive or some criticism like that. I feel like in a way these films might have or at least tried to kind of minimize the ammunition for people to say things like that. But at the same time, I feel it sounds like the nostalgia critic and others would say that we don't need all this explanation. We just need some emotional stinging power, and we're pretty much good.
Yeah, to me, it's kind of like when a joke is told. Because a joke on its own can be really funny, but if you have to take the time to explain the joke and why it's funny, then it immediately becomes less funny. So, in a similar way, by explaining everything so literally, a lot of what Disney is looking for is missing. So, hopefully, they can bring that back and get that emotional storytelling a bit stronger. I feel like they can make some good live action remakes. Excuse me. It's just as of late they felt more like a cash grab, or even if it doesn't, for one reason or another, they're still surrounded in controversy. So they gotta be very careful with their next few moves because it could make or break them for the foreseeable future.
I don't know. I feel like maybe uh, my subjective opinion on that kind of perspective is maybe a bit more or less mixed because I feel like yeah, I think you don't want something too like extremely intellectual or something that tells way much more than it shows. But at the same time, I feel like there's a lot of power and a lot more logic you can pick up on. Once again, when you have a little bit more background, you have a little bit more explanation. It doesn't necessarily have to be like outright explained, but at least you can kind of pick up on the subtle clues, which is why I have particularly high praise for like the writing of Netflix's Cobra Kai because I feel like it did that particularly well. Gave
Mhm.
some meat, more more reasoning to to the characters' actions and things like that. And I also feel like there's just a good a good value in just storytelling that's not only emotionally stimulating but also has even if it's not a feel good story, it feels like it does have some sort of like moral takeaway. Like I recently watched a performance I mentioned before of Into the Woods, and basically that show oh, blends together either a bunch of classic fairy tale plot lines into one big crossover plot, and and you see pretty much everybody more or less get what they want, but it kind of blows up in their face kind of toward the end, and and it creates this sort of cautionary tale, like how far is it right to go, or how far is too far to chase your ambition or your dream for yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of like a be careful what you wish for type of thing, from what I
Yeah,
can tell.
yeah. So I guess maybe probably have mixed feelings, I suppose, about what the nostalgia critic might be saying. I feel like yeah, yeah, some feel good emotional quality. I feel like there is a place for that to some degree, but I, I don't know. I guess it's a tricky balance that you kind of have to slowly, carefully figure out.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And he explains the emotional storytelling thing from a perspective of a guy who hasn't really enjoyed the live action remakes in general. I think from what I've heard him say over the years, he was a bit more lenient near the beginning, but he started to dislike them a lot faster than a lot of other people. So, like, his perspective has been like that for a while, and hopefully there will be one that like, changes his mind because I'd love to see some good live action remakes. But yeah, until the next one comes out, we'll have to see what Disney decides to do and how to do it and whether or not it'll be successful. It's all kind of up in the air right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That one other YouTube guy I mentioned earlier, gave a very deeply analytical and very positive review of Snow White that made it sound like it was worthy of at least a try. And I know that when I saw the theatrical trailer when I attended Wicked, like I felt pretty good about it, but any maybe I don't know. You could say anything looks good for like 30 seconds or whatever, but I'm I'm still trying to be pretty optimistic about it personally.
Which I definitely understand because, in most cases, you want to keep an open mind. I personally don't necessarily hate it or being like, I want to see this movie fail because of these controversies, blah, 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 blah.
Mm,
Just like, I'm more so just to the point where it's like, oh, look, here comes another live action remake. So maybe it's just some sort of live action remake fatigue. And I haven't seen too many that I've enjoyed. And I can't say I hate the movie because I haven't seen it. It's just right now I haven't had any inclination to go see it.
yeah, yeah, but we'll see. Things could get better.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Disney usually pulls themselves out of a ditch at some point.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for streaming this, watching, listening, and remember you can keep up with my Instagram for updates on this series at Seth underscore Mariano underscore AU. Stream us on YouTube and Spotify, and please send us your questions, comments, direct messages. That'd be appreciated.
Of course, and let us know what Disney live action remakes remakes you did like, which ones you did not like, and why. Do you think any of their official upcoming projects are going to work? Do you think they're all going to suck? Feel free to let us know your opinions. If you have seen Doug Walker, aka the Nostalgia Critics, video about emotional storytelling in these remakes, let us know if you agree with him, if you don't, maybe partially. But any thoughts, any engagement is more than welcomed and very much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, until next time, everybody take care.
So long.